Hello again. If you're just joining us, I am Tristan Tchaikovsky of TZLongsword, and I'm with Cory Winslow here visiting from MEMAG. We are talking about HEMA. Earlier we were talking about the kind of gaps in our approach to the gaps, but let's actually talk about what those gaps are. What do we know we don't know thus far about sword fighting? Not even the sources, but just what are the fundamentals that we know we don't have any sources pertaining to yet?
Well, that's a difficult question because, of course, you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. But by looking outside of our primary source material, we can see what other sources cover. So we can see what's missing from the source material that we study. Mm-hmm. So some things that specifically early KDF seem to be missing are, one, context. We're not really presented with a clear context.
You're talking about martial context.
Exactly, right. Like what applications, were these arts used for specifically? Mm-hmm. We can get an idea from other sources, but we don't really know even the rules of those contexts. Mm-hmm. So there's that. We also know that they don't discuss things that other sources discuss, such as basics of timing and distance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I think a big one for me is that whole time and distance aspect. I mean, certainly we have these relative terms. We have the Voronok and Indes, but those don't really talk too much about much, really, honestly. Those are just relative terms for, some person doing something before, some person doing something after, and someone doing something at the same time as some other action. But that doesn't get into things like speed, necessarily, whether it's physical speed as an attribute, whether it's perception speed, because those can influence how techniques work. Reacting too slow, obviously, that's a surefire way to get a sword in the head. Even acting too soon can lead to being injured if you preempt something. So yeah, that's a big thing for me that I've taken from other arts that I study, is how to deal with speed, and of course how that pertains to the space in which you're performing things. I'm actually really fond of saying that all of techniques. I mean, you talked about like social contexts for techniques for the system, but the techniques themselves, in terms of the sword moving through space, every technique, everything that happens with the sword and with the body connected to it happens in four-dimensional space. And a lot of people pay so much attention to like the three dimensions to a certain extent. I mean, distance management is a big third dimension, just that depth. But the fourth dimension of these things unrolling over time, relatively speaking, I mean, that's a huge component to how we think of and how I teach the techniques, and that can make and break a technique, all other things being the same.
Right. Yeah, and you actually touched on something that is vitally important, which is the body mechanics involved in the techniques. Mm-hmm. Because it's not enough to know, just the time and space of the techniques, but how to physically apply them in an optimal manner. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there's only so much you can do with the written language. So you even get some advice from like Joachim Meyer saying that this is better instructed with the hand than in writing, because you simply cannot describe efficiently how to physically apply some of these techniques. Mm-hmm. So we have to fill in the gaps on body mechanics and how to optimally move the sword and to strike with it and to stab and everything.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think, in your opinion, that it is more that they couldn't put it in writing because words don't really do those concepts justice, or they didn't know necessarily to expand upon those concepts in whatever words that they had available to them.
Unfortunately, we don't know.
Right. This is just another thing that we don't know.
Right, yeah. We don't know what they knew and what they didn't know. We don't know if they were, writing a series of techniques to just simply get patrons that they could teach, and that their martial art was not that effective. We don't know if the actual martial arts being taught at the time were hidden. We don't know if they lack the ability to describe their martial arts. Certainly some were more effective than others. We don't know the depth of their understanding. It's simply not certain. So I can't really form an opinion about it because I don't have enough information on it.
I mean, we've certainly, in certain lights, been a little bit optimistic. I know that, for example, looking at little glimmers of the psychology there, I've tried to make some sort of connection between the Japanese idea of seme, pressure, and zwingen, which we have in the Messer
and also
sources.
Now apparently Meyer's verführen, which is misleading or leading on, seems to be pretty closely associated.
I mean, I suppose that's our hope. That's pretty much as optimistic as we get, that we are just, by further understanding and further looking into these sources, that the concepts we hope are there kind of come to light. I suppose that's as hopeful as anyone can be, is that they did in fact know what they were talking about, and it's just our problem as the modern person trying to read a text that's 400, 500, 600 years old, and just the sheer language barrier in between there.
Right, and unfortunately we will never know for sure. So I think that's why it's really important to advocate studying different martial arts to fill in those gaps, because you can only go so far studying a single source. And if it is your goal to learn how to fight well, as opposed to just study a single historical source, I think it's really important to branch out and learn as much as you can, because there is only one art of fencing that's involving time and distance and space and all the physical motions and manipulation of your opponent's psychology. And we can learn that from various sources, not just single ones frozen in time.
And it makes you wonder, actually, if again, to kind of go back to the idea of the more purist approach, or the more collaborative, I suppose, approach, the frog DNA approach.
Bird DNA.
The bird DNA, I suppose, it's more appropriate. But if these systems, if we should even call them systems, even if they were meant to be standalone kind of martial entities for whatever context that they were intended for, or if the fencer, the combatant, was expected in their own time to branch out and learn, not necessarily take the dilettante approach that we also see in modern HEMA today, but to learn as much as possible from as many different sources as possible to be the best fighter, the best fencer that they could in fact be. Kind of the itinerant swordsman sort of approach.
That's actually a luxury we have today that they may not have had back then, is that we have access to so much information on the internet. They didn't have that. They would have to travel and study with different masters. So, I mean, they would be isolated in their own studies. But I'm sure if you want to, back then even, if you wanted to learn to be a competent swordsman, you would study with as many masters as you can, which is what we're told in MS 3227A that Master Johannes Liechtenauer himself did. So if you want to be like Master Johannes Liechtenauer, I would suggest studying with as many masters as you can, traveling around and learning.
So,
arts.
The final thought, which is perhaps just a reiteration of the previous comment, could we say, in fact, to be the most Lichtenarian fencer that you could possibly be, would that be, in fact, the approach, is to go off, learn as much as possible, and then make your own art?
I believe so, yes. Otherwise, the art is dead. We haven't actually brought it back.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to both of us on our YouTube channels. And if you really like what you see, please feel free to join us on our Patreon accounts as well.